Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're going to get set up here and let's hope it all works out. All right, we should be in presentation mode now. So yes, good morning. My name is Michelle Casillas. I have with me, and I'm the proposal team manager for the Office of Sponsored Projects. Today I have with me Jeremy and Mark, they're going to be introducing themselves. We are glad to have you all with us, and we're going to get right to it. Jeremy, did you want to go ahead and start?
All right, thanks, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see some familiar faces and also some people that are new in the audience, so welcome. As a brief introduction, my name is Jeremy Hamlin. I'm the Associate Controller in the Contract and Grant Accounting Office. I've been at UNM for 5.5 years in the Contract and Grant Office. And before that, I was in public accounting as an audit manager for 8 years, where I specialized in A133 single audits and federal compliance audits. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michelle for her introduction.
Yeah, so I've already given you my title, but a little bit about me and my background. So I have been a research administrator, like some of you. I managed projects for a nonprofit organization. That's where I kind of started my career. And then I came over to the University Health Sciences Center in around 2010, and I oversaw one of the privately funded sponsored projects there. Had both an academic and programmatic components, and I got an opportunity to learn a lot about a lot of things, including policy, because the health policy was one of the focuses of the project. From there, I went to work for the New Mexico Education Department. I was the Director of Operations Executive Affairs there, and had the opportunity to really kind of take a deep dive into learning how administrative law works, and also regulating to some extent for-profit higher education institutions. So that's what I bring to this conversation, and I'm going to hand that off to Mark.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Appreciate your patience as we got a few things worked out this morning. As Michelle said, my name is Mark Manalani. And I'm currently the contract team manager here in the Office of Sponsored Projects. I have been in this role for 6 months at this point, 10 days in the office prior to disbanding for COVID. So it's been quite the learning experience at this point. However, I have been with the university for approximately 9 years. I came to UNM from private industry, where I was a credit manager for the Wells Fargo Private Bank. In my time here at UNM prior to OSP, I spent that time all in the Dean's office at the College of Arts and Sciences in various roles, from accountant 3 to financial analyst, and most recently as a financial officer. So I'm excited to be in OSP, and it's great to work with you guys. So I appreciate your time this morning. Michelle? So what is the mission of OSP and CGA? Here in OSP, we really operate at a delicate intersection of ensuring that our constituents are working in compliance with established institutional policies and procedures, federal, state, local laws, and providing the tools and support that's necessary to allow all of our PIs to focus on conducting their research at the level of excellence that's expected here at an R1 institution. And Jeremy will discuss the role of CGA and how what their mission does to serve your researchers.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, and here in CGA, our mission is very similar to that in OSP. You know, we strive to provide quality customer service to our PIs and researchers in the management of their external funding, and strive to provide guidance and support to ensure compliance with UNM policy, state law, federal regulations, and agency terms and conditions. And on the CGA side, we really focus on the post-award, so a lot of the financial aspects of monitoring your award, and we'll interface with a lot of central offices, including payroll, purchasing, just among a few. So.
Well, just to get us started, I wanted to go over some of the general expectations and outcomes that you should expect from this presentation. What we have today is an opportunity for us as professionals. This is an advanced group, so us as professionals to learn together. We want this to be an opportunity for you to take some valuable lessons learned away from this. We will be discussing some applicable policies just briefly, and then we'll be reviewing case studies. There's one case study that is a UNM case study, and another is a non-UNM case study. As I mentioned, as we all are professionals learning together here, we of course did not include any specific names, titles, or are we pinpointing any specific department. And again, this is really an opportunity for us to provide some good takeaways so that we can help you prevent costly errors for your units. And finally, in the last we will be pointing to internal and external resources available. So just as I mentioned, the applicable policies that we'll be discussing are really the federal policies under uniform guidance. And so with that, I'm sure many of you are very familiar, but this is a streamlined and consolidated set of federal government regulations for receiving and using federal awards. As an institution, we receive federal funding for research, service, and some instruction. And OSP and CGA are really responsible for ensuring that uniform guidance is followed closely for compliance purposes, but also for consistent management. Other than that, as a state public higher education institution, and just as an operating business in the state, we are subject to state law. So there are a variety of state laws that have been contemplated and included, and you'll see those most play out in our UNM policies. They're typically embedded in the UNM policies so that we are compliant with state law. And then kind of more locally, we as the university have what has been produced as internal guidance. And this is where leadership has had the opportunity to really dive through all the applicable laws, find an intersection that works not only to keep us compliant, but also to ensure that we're still focused on building a robust research enterprise and have continued growth. And those all can be found on our individual OSP or CGA websites. A little bit, deeper into kind of some general background about what we're going to be talking about today. As a higher education institution, the university does have a shared governance model, and shared governance models account for two important concepts. The first is really granting various groups of people a share in key decision making, but the second is also granting certain constituencies within the whole the primary responsibilities for specific areas of decision making. When it comes to specific areas of decision making, OSP and CGA have been granted delegated authority for financial management of sponsored projects. However, since we are in a shared governance model, I can't really kind of impress upon the importance enough, and that is the importance of communication and collaboration. Communication and collaboration is imperative But in communicating and collaborating both from the core offices and at the department level, it is important that we use facts and reliable sources. And sometimes that is in the way of, going back to those policies and using the citations that are coming directly from those sources. So, we'll talk a little bit about some of the sources that are applicable to these case studies and give you a few tools on that. And then finally, just wanted to make sure that generally our roles in OSP and CGA are identified through this presentation. But one of the roles that we want you to walk away with is that we play a support role. We play a support role in supporting research administrators and PIs in ensuring that they have the information available to find a path forward for their research, but while doing that in compliance, and then keeping in mind that what we want is a long-standing relationship with sponsors, and we don't want to over-obligate ourselves to anything that we wouldn't want the university to have to deal with at the end of the day. With that said, I'm going to hand this over to Jeremy, and he's going to jump into the case study.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, so let's get started on our first case study, which happens to be a UNM case study. And again, to reiterate what Michelle mentioned, this is not meant to embarrass or call anybody out, but it actually presents a really good a learning opportunity for all involved. So our goal with this is really to, hopefully we can all take something from this and learn from it so that we can prevent something like this from happening again in the future. So the issue at hand here, a little background and a fact pattern for this case study. It involved a federal program that was governed by uniform guidance, so a federal grant. And this program has a long history at both the sponsoring agency as well as at UNM. And really the issue at hand in this particular case study has to do with compensation, in particular compensation for the PI on the project. And a lot of the issues centered around a supplemental administrative component, or a SAC. And essentially the SAC was named for the project and allocated in the PI's full rate that was included in the proposal to the sponsor. So that's just a brief background and introduction into the issue at hand. Now, something I think is worth noting is the problem really wasn't identified until years down the road, when the federal sponsor did a audit, a review of this particular program. And that's kind of where a lot of the facts and the details kind of came to be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and we're going to do a little brain game.
Hey everybody, so I'm going to work with Natalie to call on you. We have a couple questions this morning, kind of get the discussion going and see who's had their cups of coffee. So when you think you have an answer, please utilize the hand raise function, and Natalie and I will work to call on you. So in the description that Jeremy's provided, can you see anything off the top that you believe may have gone wrong in this instance? And if you raise your hands, we'll see if we can call on you here. Nothing that anybody sees may have been wrong in this instance. If we have a SAC and Natalie, can you unmute Estella, please?
The SAC wasn't part of the original base salary.
Right. Morning, Estella. Thank you. Right. In this case, we had a special administrative component that's not part of the IBS, as Estella had mentioned. Are there any other things that you see may have gone wrong in this case? Okay. Is there anything about this situation that just doesn't feel right to you? Anything in the description that would have set off alarm bells for you at the beginning or during a proposal phase or during your budget development, or even in pre-discussion of a possible award in this manner. Okay. We know, as a special administrative component, as Estella mentioned, being not part of the base.
So the base has to be kept separate, right, from the SAC?
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more further on, but yes, thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you guys for your feedback this morning. And we'll go ahead and continue on here, and I'll hand it back to Jeremy to go over a little more of detail.
All right, thank you, Mark, and I appreciate the feedback, Sylvia and Acela. You guys are spot on. Let's kind of dive into what went wrong, and I think it's important too on this case study to talk a little bit about what went right in this particular scenario. So, as alluded to, the SAC is not part of the institutional base rate. It's an administrative component, and as the title suggests, it is administrative in nature and should not be charged to a sponsored project. So that's kind of the first thing that we identified. The second thing that we eventually found out was the SAC was intended to be essentially an extra compensation component that would follow uniform guidance and the extra service pay. But the problem with it is the extra compensation, the way it was done as a SAC, did not follow UNM's own institutional guidelines and procedures for dealing with extra service pay or extra compensation. So right off the bat, you guys nailed it. The SAC component and charging it to the sponsored projects was problematic. Now, to talk a little bit about what went right, I think it's important to note that throughout the audit process, the Contract and Grant Accounting Office is the designated liaison with any auditors, whether it be external auditors that do our single audit every year or agency auditors. And we had from the get-go full cooperation and support from the department and PI throughout the audit process. They were very involved, very cooperative, and certainly there was no ill intent or anything of that nature in this case study. And I think it's important too that the department and PI did allow CGA to perform that function and to fulfill their role as the audit liaison. So they left all communication and official correspondence up to the Contract and Grant Accounting Office in dealing with this particular issue. So let's look a little bit, diving into this case study a little more, some of the factors in identifying the problem. And again, the point of this presentation is try to identify problems and how we can avoid question costs, especially now when we have an environment in which our unrestricted and PI over expenditure indices are really closely monitored and may have some budget constraints. So there's two things I think we need to focus on here: external factors that contributed to the problem and internal factors. From an external point of view, as I mentioned, this is a federal program, and as such, it follows the uniform guidance for all federal grant compliance matters. And within uniform guidance, they actually discuss the salary basis that should be included in a proposal and award, and they do talk a little bit about extra service pay or extra compensation. The section in uniform guidance that deals with this is 200.430, and it's compensation for personal services. And within that section, there's actually a specific subsection designated and carved out specifically for institutions of higher education, or IHEs. And within there, they talk about the salary basis, and they basically explain that charges for work performed are allowable at the IBS rate. Now, what does that mean? IBS stands for institutional base salary, and it essentially means the annual compensation paid by an institution of higher ed for an individual's appointment whether that be time spent on research, administration, or instruction, or any other activities. But I think the key word there is it's essentially time spent for fulfilling your appointment and your contract, regardless of how your time is allocated between research roles, administrative roles, and teaching components. Within UG, they also, like I said, outline extra service pay. And what they define it as is it represents overload compensation subject to institutional compensation policies. And I think that's the key point here is any reference in the uniform guidance to extra service pay or extra compensation immediately points back to the institution's policies and procedures that have to be adhered to. And that gets us to the internal factors. So within UNM, we actually have a very clear and precise extra compensation guidelines. And in this particular case study, they just weren't followed appropriately. What we would expect to see is an internal approval process and an external approval process. And it would be done through an extra compensation request form that actually routes to the fiscal monitor and contract and grant accounting so that they can make sure it meets both of those requirements. From an institutional approval perspective, there's really three components of extra compensation that have to be met in order for it to be allowable. First, it's got to be for work performed outside of a faculty member's regular departmental load. So again, it's work outside of that base instruction, research, and administrative component in your research contract. The second criteria is it has to meet either consultation across departmental lines. So for instance, someone in anthropology is doing something for the pathology department. That would be a clear example of someone crossing departmental lines to do work. Or it's got to be for work involving a separate or remote operation. So something very unique and specific. And the third component or criteria is that it cannot conflict with the faculty member's regular load or their base contract. So it's got to meet all three of those criteria in order to meet the internal agency approval. And then if it meets all of that, we still have to get external approval. And that usually requires that extra compensation is either spelled out in the budget and budget justification, or if it's not, we actually have to go back to the sponsor for specific pre-approval to charge extra compensation. So that's just a little background on the external and internal factors. And I think Mark has a little bit to add on the third bullet for the internal factors.
Thank you, Jeremy. So as Jeremy mentioned, one of the internal factors was the inaccurate distribution of salary. And what do we mean by that? What is salary distribution? What do we mean by job suffix? Okay. We all have a position number here at UNM. Okay. That's our job number. Specifically for your 9-month faculty, they have a position number. It always begins with F9. F9, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that might be for the individual. The suffix at the end of that for base pay is 00. Okay, that gives your that's your faculty member's base contractual 9-month pay. In this case, the additional compensation guidelines would have been ended with an S1 or an S2. The S stands for the special administrative component, right? The 1, the 2, or even sometimes 3 means how many additional SACs does this individual have? So in this case, the research administrators and the fiscal staff could work together to ensure that the special administrative component of the job position was only distributed to an unrestricted index, okay? Rather than having that special administrative job suffix on a restricted award where we know that's unallowable. So in this case, one of the internal factors is the proper distribution of those position suffixes. So collaborating and keeping in touch with your fiscal staff and your research administrators to understand those requirements and what is allowed on the award is extremely important. Jeremy?
All right, thank you, Mark. So what actually happened in this case study? Let's get to the finish line here on this particular case study and look at some of the outcomes. Now, the issue identified with the supplemental administrative component led to question costs by our federal sponsor auditors. And the question costs in total were $95,000. And that breakout was $63,000 of total direct cost, including salary and fringe, and about $32,000 in our F&A or indirect costs. So as you can imagine, this came as a shock, and nobody, especially in this climate, like I said, in this environment that we're in, I think would want to or could afford to take a close to a $100,000 hit on a PI over expenditure index or on any other unrestricted index for that matter. This is kind of a cost that nobody's anticipating. So our goal again is to eliminate the possibility of these unusual or question costs, especially in times when a budget is something that's really hard to come by. And like I said, through cooperation and collaboration, which was paramount in this case with the department and PI, our office was able to negotiate with the federal sponsor. And essentially what happened is they came up with a new IBS rate that was negotiated internally for the PI in question going forward. The SAC, of course, was disallowed on the project. The interesting thing on this particular case study, which I want to emphasize is extremely rare and I've never seen before, they actually let us retroactively apply the new IBS rate to the beginning of the project over multiple years. I've never seen that. I would never expect to see that again. I think the cooperation and collaboration we had on this particular audit and review throughout the process kind of led to the federal sponsor willing to make some concessions for the benefit of all involved. So it essentially ended up being a positive outcome, but it set itself up for something that was very problematic and could have led to almost $100,000 in a loss that would have had to be covered by the department. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark again for another brain game.
And Mark,
So real quick,
I'm going to interrupt you real quick, Mark, just to give you guys, it's the 10-minute warning.
you know what? Why don't we go ahead and skip the brain game in this one because it's more of a quiz and we kind of touched on all these things about what could have been done differently.
Okay.
If we get to the next case study, Michelle, we'll touch on that briefly and ensure we have some time for questions. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this slide in too much detail because you can see some of the outcomes. But this is a non-UN example. And what we have here is an instance where a concerned research administrator felt there were some irregularities in some form submissions. That research administrator brought the concern to the appropriate university partners, and it was ultimately discovered that a researcher was falsifying their IRB paperwork. Okay. You can see here, as I mentioned, there's some specific results presented that highlight the importance of an institution's self-reporting and a great job of that administrator for coming forward when something just didn't seem right. Okay? So in both of these cases had positive outcomes. And again, both of these instances really highlight the importance of collaborating with your official agency liaisons in both OSP and CGA. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Michelle and we'll get on to some lessons learned.
All right, well, that was probably a lot of information for everyone. So we're just gonna try to summarize some of this and then we'll get to a few resources and a few questions, hopefully. Proactive approach, in order to try to, one of the things that we've learned over and over again is, the proactive approach is always better, especially at avoiding costs, than the reactive approach. Typically, the reactive approach can get us into a situation where we can't avoid the costs, and that's, you know, where we'll have to pay. Either, you know, either case study really pointed to that. In the second case study, one of the things that Mark didn't quite mention, but I think it's important takeaway, is the professor himself actually had about $132,000 of civil settlements in, you know, in taking the actions that a professor did have to take, and the university still had to return $1.6 million. So again, proactive approach is what we want you to take away from this. You know, this starts at the proposal stage. One of the things that Jeremy talked about is the extra compensation guidelines. In the process that you'll find is really a starting point from the proposal. As mentioned in Jeremy's presentation, in the budget and budget justification, extra compensation absolutely needs to be spelled out very clearly so that the sponsor can identify that and can approve that, you know, as a separate line item. So that's where it should start. You have questions, the proposal team is definitely here to help you. And then following just institutional guidelines, policies, and procedures. At the end of this, you'll see, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a number of these things just, you know, readily available for you by going to OSP's website or CGA's website. We don't want you to have to kind of go through books, or not books anymore, but websites and websites of policies to search what's applicable to the work that you're doing. Instead, we try to make that very easy by really having a repository on our websites. So those guidelines, policies, and procedures that we talked about today and others that will be applicable are available on our website. And then the last is, when you identify an issue or problem, it is okay. You know, we don't operate from our end assuming that anyone has intended to create an issue or a problem. It really, you know, in some cases it happens, but what really makes the difference is how we recover. So the first of that is really be accountable, own it. You identified the issue, maybe you contributed to it, maybe not. But you know, you can own the fact that it's there and it has to be fixed. And then be resourceful, reach out to the appropriate offices. Maybe that is your department and some of the folks that are, you know, operating at a higher level in your department, but don't forget to include OSP and CGA, even if it's just one of us, and you know, oftentimes I'm on the proposal team. I go to Jeremy day in and day out and use his knowledge. So you can come to me and I can get you to Jeremy, or you can get straight to Jeremy if you know that that's where the question goes, or Mark, for that matter. You know, we're all here to help. And then be cooperative. Again, you know, a collaborative approach can lead to great outcomes for everyone involved. And you know, this is what we're talking about here, is being collaborative and cooperative in solving problems. You know, so if there's a problem to be solved, it's better to have more heads thinking about the solution than just one mind and one approach, because you know, there may be blind spots and you'll have some coverage when you include other people in the approach. So definitely these are hopefully a few key takeaways that you can take from this. Those are pretty broad. One other one that's not listed here though, and I want to kind of make it clear, because it was related to the UNM case study. That is, in the case that you see something within your budget that has the word administration on it, that would be a point in time where you would want to stop and start questioning. We have facilities in administration, you know, F&A, also referred to as indirect costs. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to overcharge the federal government. So be sure that, you know, you look for those key terms that might help you to determine if a problem is actually a problem. That summarizes that. Jeremy, it's your turn.
All right, thank you, Michelle. And wrapping up here, I know we're running out of time and we want to get to a little bit of Q&A. So just want to point you all to some resources that are out there. I know Natalie added the websites in the chat, so thank you, Natalie. There's OSP and CGA's websites. Within each of those websites, I'll point you particularly to a tab of special interest for this topic, and that's the resources tab on both the OSP website listed under PI resources, and under the contract and grant accounting website, we have a resources tab. And within there, you're going to find links to policies, procedures, and guidelines, not only internally, but also on the CGA website. We do link to federal resources like Uniform Guidance, the FARs, and actually federal sponsor websites for agency-specific terms and conditions. And then there's some links there to UNM's extra comp guidelines, and then the UG electronic version and the FARS electronic version.